This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com. I have with me this morning John Rubino, well-known author and publisher of the website dollarcollapse.com. Good morning, John. Welcome back to Macro Analytics.
Morning, Gord. Nice to be back.
Isn't it? Have you had any vacation?
Well, we've been getting out on the boat a fair bit this summer just because it's incredibly hot. And this is the time in Idaho when you do that. You know, there's water all around and it gets up into the high 90s. And so, yeah, I've been taking vacations in one-day chunks throughout the summer.
Well, I've noticed on the web the amount of interviews and articles you've been putting out, and I wondered whether you had a vacation. And I have to tell you, I was reading those from my boat out at Nantucket. So I've got my chart station looks like it's right out of Star Wars. It's my wife says I can't get any more electronics in there.
It's getting easier and easier to keep on working on vacation now. I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or bad thing, but it's definitely happening.
It's a terrible thing, but you know the kinds of things that we're seeing going on and you and I talk about, I personally find so fascinating that it's like a soapbox serial that you're watching. You just got to see the next one. And you know, every day I pick up the Wall Street Journal and I kind of shake my head, and here we go again. John, I did a show with about a month ago with Charles Hugh Smith, and we called it the subprime economy. And I'll refer some of our first-time listeners to that. But what I wanted today to do is to springboard from it, because you and I have had so many discussions on the degree of credit and the problems with credit that's been going on over the last few years, and to bring it home because of your series that you have of how the government has been misleading in so many different ways. And one of the charts that I'd like us to reference as we go through here is this one that's showing the change in credit and the problem the government has in really expanding credit. Because, you know, prior to the crisis, 2007, the growth in credit was primarily mortgages, as everybody's certainly well aware. Well, you can see that it collapsed, and we've been trying to get it out. And the explosion has been in student loans and auto loans and the games that we're going to talk about that are going on behind the scenes. But the government has got to get these credit areas, which are not just student loans and auto loans, you can see are listed here, up. Now, how do they do that? In a 70% economy, it's everything. Well, with real disposable income shrinking, what's it going to do? Well, I would argue that it's starting to cheat, as it did, John, exactly the same in 2007. But before that, with the regulatories, where in fact it was looking the other way to if anybody could get a mortgage. And something we talked about a couple shows ago is I think we hit a wall last fall. Absolutely, and I've got all sorts of examples that I've referenced in previous shows. And I saw this chart, and it really shows the crush that's happened with the consumer, that the only thing they can buy right now are the absolute bare essentials, the things that they must buy. The frivolous kinds of things have been stopped. I see it in boating traffic has just fallen dramatically. And this time last year, and why I put this Coke can up, you and I were talking quite extensively of the games that were going on to hide inflation in the stores, the games with sizes of packaging, the content that was in them, bottoms of the bottles that are being hollowed out so they have less ounces. And just in the last 3 weeks, we've seen the soda pop industry saying they're going to a smaller can to help us with our sugar content. Of course, you're going to find out that you're paying more per ounce, and it's a way of driving up margins. But you did an article just out on fake credit scores, and I thought we'd kick it off with that to really show as an example exactly what's going on with what the government's doing here to manipulate and get this credit up.
Yeah, What's happening now is that banks can't find enough solid borrowers to lend money to based on the credit scores of the people walking in the door. So instead of drawing the logical conclusion, which is that it's time to pull back on lending because there aren't that many people who can actually pay you back out there anymore, what the American credit system is doing is looking at ways to improve people's credit scores by changing the rules, basically. They're going to start eliminating stuff like, for instance, if you had a past due loan and you had debt collectors after you, but you finally settled up with them last month, they're going to take that out of your credit report, whereas it used to stay on the report for a while as a way of showing lenders that, you know, you had some trouble just lately. Well, they're going to take that out. And if you have some health care related expenses, they're going to take some of those out too. And I'm not sure why that is, you know, because healthcare is that's a cost and a debt just like any other debt. But they're going to take some of those out. The net effect is going to be to take people in the fair category, let's say, you know, in the mid 600s on your credit score, move you up into the good category, 680 and above, and in that way allow you to qualify for loans that you might not have qualified for in the past, or to be able to borrow money on better terms or whatever, as a way of convincing you that borrowing money is actually a good thing now. And so the banks will be able to make more loans, people will be able to buy more cars and houses and take more nice vacations, all with borrowed money. And in the Keynesian theoretical framework that governs our economic policy making right now, that is seen as a good thing, convincing people who shouldn't be borrowing money to borrow money and buy basically frivolous stuff that they don't actually need. Is seen as a way of getting the economy moving, because getting the economy moving, in other words, increasing aggregate demand, increasing GDP this year, is basically all the guys in charge care about now. You know, they don't look at the balance sheet side of the economy. They don't look at how much debt it takes to get that GDP number, and that's where they're missing the boat, and where they have been missing the boat for the last 30 years. You know, if you take on too much debt to buy something that doesn't return an adequate cash flow to pay off the debt, then you actually get poorer. Even though GDP looks bigger, the wealth that actually exists in society goes down. And that's what we've been doing for the last 30 years. We've actually been getting poorer by borrowing money unwisely and investing that money in stuff that doesn't end up generating adequate cash flow. That's called malinvestment. And we're basically ridden by malinvestment right now as a society. That's basically the bedrock asset that we have now, stuff that we shouldn't have bought in the first place.
Well, see, John, we no longer really have a capitalist society, and by that, capitalism is based on the profits are called savings, and that savings is then returned and invested. And our investment today is and that's what drives wealth. Well, we're not reinvesting. The investment is not being made. What we have instead is we're using credit to generate consumption, and using consumption as the growth. And that, when you're a 70% economy, that works until people run out of wealth or run out of collateral to be able to lend against credit. And that's what we're having. So
Gord, that chart that you showed a couple of charts back that explains what people are spending their money on now, this year versus last year, is so telling, because, we actually have a growing economy as the government calculates growth. But it's happening because people are having to spend more and more on the necessities of life, which are going up in price. And that's leaving them less and less for things like electronics and travel and eating out in restaurants. So in that sense, that's a profile of people becoming poorer and poorer. You know, they're having to scale back the fun stuff in life just to pay the heating bill, just to put food on the table. And you're right, that can only go on for a little while before the consumer discretionary side of the economy. In other words, the stuff we don't absolutely have to buy to live, but we would really like to buy, you know, new cars, vacations, et cetera, until that part of the economy just craters. Because there's no money left to take nice vacations or buy new cars. And we are headed for that point at a very fast rate, it looks like now. You know, basically the amount of money we're spending on discretionary stuff is cratering right now. So that industry has got to be hurting badly.
John, when you see Family Dollar and Dollar Tree and these kinds of stores having to merge because they're getting squeezed so badly on the margins, and you see Walmart plummeting on same-store sales and talking about the stress that their consumers are under, it has arrived. So the compression of what the basic things that people need to spend on to be able to exist is giving them no room to move. But the government figures it's got to do something. So it's changing the rules. And, what are the basic things that people have to spend on right now? Or where are they? Car loans, student loans, mortgages, credit cards, and frankly, existing debt called the HELOCs or home equity lines that everybody forgets about that we really need to talk about. And, let's just go through them. John, the car loans. We have watched people go from owning cars to now they're leasing. It's just leases that they're now going with because they can't afford the maintenance that comes with a car that gets a little older. If you get a lease car, before you get your first maintenance bill, hell, they don't even change the tires on them, you return the car. And by the way, what's the problem with that? Well, we've got so many used cars that are coming off lease that nobody can buy them, that the residual values of these lease cars is going to plummet. The same as what happened with mortgages in 2007 when suddenly the houses weren't the same or weren't as high a price, and so suddenly they wanted more down payments on the cars. And this is all part of the shadow banking system. So what do? Well, what's happening now is the games that are being played to get people into these cars. The government's is now investigating the same kinds of issues that we saw with the subprime in mortgages. Now, what will they do? I think they'll get really lenient and look the other way. I don't know if you're seeing that.
Well, that's what is happening in the car lending business right now. Is they're giving loans to people who didn't used to qualify for them. But they're giving those loans at higher interest rates and for longer periods of time. So now, if you have not so great credit, you go to a car dealership, they will give you a car, but on terms that's more like a car mortgage than a car loan, where you pay a fairly high interest rate and they stretch it out for like 7 years. So you're locked into that car for a really long time with really high payments. And so yes, you get a new car, but your life gets harder from that point on, because you've bought a depreciating asset that you have to pay interest on for 3 times as long as the original car loans back when they were making legitimate car loans would used to run. And so for the car companies, that means that they're taking future growth. Somebody who used to buy a car every 3 or 4 years is now locked in for 7 years. So they're going to lose sales out there in the future in return for the sales they're making today. And for individuals, it means that you have this payment you've got to make basically for forever, from the normal person's standpoint. And that's money that can't go into vacations, can't go into buying a new house, can't go into buying nice clothes, anything like that. And so the rest of your spending is going to have to go down. So this pumps up GDP in the short run, but at the cost of slower growth in the future. And since we've been doing this across the board, that creates a society in which all the growth happened in the last few years and very little growth is going to happen in the future. So, car loans is now approaching the same level as student loans. Student loans passed $1 trillion a few years ago. Car loans are up to about $900 billion now and heading for $1 trillion very quickly. Now, student loans were the bubble of the last couple of years. We basically convinced people to go deeply into debt to put their kids through school. And it's turning out, on the one hand, that those college degrees aren't really generating the kind of jobs that would be needed to pay off these loans. So we've got massive amounts of debt sitting on top of our new college graduates who really don't have the ability to pay it off, and defaults are starting to spike. So what the government is doing here is they're saying, okay, we'll change the way that you pay back your loans. From now on, you'll just pay 10% of your annual income against your student loans. So whatever you make, if you make a lot of money, you pay a lot. If you make very little money, you pay very little. And in that way, we'll make college loans affordable. And that'll do two things. First of all, it'll keep people out of bankruptcy, keep them from defaulting on their student loans going forward, and encourage people to borrow more in the present because they assume that their payments will be manageable no matter what happens in the future. Again, this is basically the government lying to us about the amount of debt that we're taking on by making the terms seem easier than they really are. Because if you're paying 10% of your income against your student loans and you don't make all that much money, it takes you a lifetime to pay off those loans. So you're saddled with that debt forever. And again, you can't spend money on anything else. If 10% of your income is going to this one loan, that doesn't include your mortgage and your credit cards and your car loan, all the other stuff that the government wants you to borrow money against. Already 10% of your income is going to one chunk of debt. So you're poorer than you would be otherwise going forward.
Are you seeing what the changes that they're proposing, or the banks are pressuring the regulators concerning mortgages and the FHFA?
Yeah, basically the housing industry has never recovered to levels that the government would consider acceptable. That is back to the 2005-2006 bubble levels. And so one of the reasons that's not happening is that there aren't that many people who qualify for mortgages that can be sold by the bank to the government to be repackaged into asset-backed loans. So what they're looking at doing is easing the criteria for banks lending on mortgages now, so that before, when you had to have a 20% down payment, well, we'll lower that to some smaller number. And the government will still buy those loans from banks and repackage them as mortgage-backed loans. So that allows the banks to lend to people that they couldn't previously lend to and still sell those loans to repackagers, which gives the banks more cash with which to make more loans. And so that kind of greases the wheels of the credit creation process. And here again, it used to be that to get a conforming loan, you had to have pretty good credit, you had to demonstrate a very solid ability to pay, and you had to have a pretty good down payment. Well, we're lessening all that now. Now you don't have to have such good credit, you don't have to make as much money, and you don't have to have as big a down payment, and they'll still lend you money against a house. So same thing, it's really the same story across the board. And they're hoping in this way to increase house prices, which will allow people to take out home equity credit lines against the equity that is growing in their houses, and then you begin again to use their houses as ATMs like they did in the previous decade. And that's an interesting story, because so many equity lines of credit were taken out during the credit bubble and are now, after 10 years, starting to switch over from interest only to amortization, where you got to pay both the interest and the principal on the loan, and that makes your payments jump up. So all of these people that took out home equity credit lines in 2003, 2004, 2005 are now looking at suddenly higher payments. In addition to everything else, they're already probably stressed financially because of their credit card debt and their student loan debt and that car loan they just took out. Well, now their HELOC is getting ready to cost them a couple extra $100 a month. And so that's going to be a big problem going forward, and we can expect the government to change the rules in some way to make this easier for people to manage and to encourage them to take out new HELOCs. We don't know what they're doing yet with that, but it's probably going to happen in the near future based on all the other trends out there.
There's no question about it, John, and you probably won't see anything really of high visibility in the press. This year we've got nearly 1 million families that have HELOCs out that are coming due. That's $23 billion, and that's doubling every year. I saw Wells has got between 28 and 74 billion is going from 28 to 74 billion in the next 2 years. J.P. Morgan is going to 49 billion. These are coming due, and I saw examples of people who are being hit because they'd put them on 10 years, interest only. Now it's coming due, and then they expect principal and interest, as you said, amortized over minimally 15 years. People that had just a $70,000 loan because they had their Cancun and their pool and all the things people were doing back there, and suddenly the bill would go from $270 a month to $560. That's where all the discretionary's gone. And some of this is even more dramatic. Some of these people at 100,000 where 3.5% is going from $292 up to $715 a month. So that's the crush, and they've got to somehow pull some leverage off that. And the banks are putting pressure on the regulators to change the rules so that they can do it. So it's the old thing: if you can't make the goal, change the rules, and the government's really got no choice on it right now. And I don't know. I think we're addressing the wrong problem, because if you look at these are just articles I've listed here. In the last 2 weeks, we got 35% of America that are getting debt calls from collection agencies. So, by the way, I read last night that now the big subject in the Senate is trying to change the rules on debt collections on the calls they can make, specifically to any member of the armed forces, because people in the armed forces that are causing all sorts of problems at home while they're being deployed, and the government's saying, no, we can't have that happening to our troops. I understand that. My heart goes out to the situation, but it's and you know that's not going to be unique to the armed forces, right? It's going to be much larger. But we've got 77 million in America facing debt collectors right now. So all of these things we just talked about is allowing debt to increase. Make some sense out of this for me, John.
Well, in a well-run society that was actually, adult, we would take this as a sign that it's time to stop borrowing so much money and start paying off debt. If you're a family and you're in a situation like this, usually you sit around the kitchen table and you start seeing what you can cut back in order to make your payments and actually start paying off some of this debt to get back on your feet. Well, as a country, we don't seem to do that. We don't conclude from the stats that you just mentioned that it's time to raise interest rates to make saving attractive rather than borrowing, and to cut government spending and to insist that people begin living within their means. We don't do any of that. What we do is try to figure out ways to keep the borrowing going, because again, the theory that animates public policy in the U.S. says that growth via consumption is the target, and any amount of debt that's necessary to give us 4% growth through people buying stuff is good. And so that's what we do over and over and over again. And this isn't new. In every cycle starting in the 1980s, we've come to the same conclusion. Whenever there's a slowdown, we figure out ways to encourage people to borrow more money. We either do it via the government borrowing huge amounts of money and then spending it on whatever it feels like spending it on to make people feel richer and get them to borrow money, or the government just lowers interest rates to the point where asset prices go up. Incredibly low interest rates lead to higher stock and bond prices, and that, in theory, makes people feel richer. This is called the wealth effect, and then causes people to be willing to borrow more money. But people borrowing money is the target. We have lots of different tools to bring that about, but every tool is aimed at the same target. And eventually you reach an endpoint where you just can't borrow any more money. There are no more tricks that you can pull out of the hat that will allow you to convince people that it's a good idea to take on a new car loan or a mortgage or whatever. And it seems like we're getting there. These numbers just don't seem manageable anymore.
What happens is that consumption robs savings. We all say we know there's no savings anymore, but the more you consume, the less savings that's available. And it's savings, as I said earlier, that's used for reinvestment that leads to productivity improvements, that leads to wealth that allows you to grow. Well, what's happened is consumption has completely taken over and there is no savings left. And the best analogy, my grandfather was a farmer. And he used to say, you know, you got to have so much in the granary for next year's crop. You can't sit here or sell this year's seed corn or next year's seed corn to finance the farm and finance your income to go and buy the new truck. I've got to have it. And so farmers learned that you've got to keep planning and holding back certain amount to reinvest. Well, we don't do that. We're all sitting at the granary eating all the food and everything's happy. Well, we got nothing to plan anymore. And so eventually there's no crops coming in to feed the family. And that's what maybe a bad analogy, but that consumption is completely robbing our capitalist system's ability to invest. And even the investment that's going on right now, because we can create more money, is not going into productive means because we have such a distorted mispricing and malinvestment that they're not being able to generate real profits. And the way to look at that is EBITDA is plummeting, John. The companies have cash from borrowing, but they're not generating new cash. The last year has just went south. And that's a serious, because that's the measure of wealth, John, not the stock market, which is it's a measure of discounted free cash flow. And the market traditionally called enterprise value reflects that. It doesn't reflect that anymore. And these numbers I'm talking about, EBITDA, clearly shows this drop. And it's the buybacks because of, and I wrote a paper on this, of the tax advantage you get by buying back your share. And they're going to do this until there's no shares left. And then they'll go into a massive mergers and acquisition as they print more money. Print more shares in a counterfeit fashion to go out and take over other companies. I mean, it's clear, and a government, I guess, would want that. Got a little off track there, John. I apologize. We need to wrap. Closing comments to wrap this together for our listeners.
Yeah, something that ties into what you just said, Gord. We have invested a lot of money over the past couple of decades, but it's been in stuff that isn't actually productive. You know, we built huge amounts of retail space, for instance, over the last 20 years. The square footage of retail space per capita in the U.S. just soared. And this was happening at a time when online retailing was taking market share from bricks and mortar stores anyhow, and when we were impoverishing our consumers by encouraging them to borrow too much money in the short run. And so all of this retail investment that we've made, a huge amount of it turned out to be malinvestment, turned out to be stuff that's not worth it anymore. So we're seeing malls close across the country, and so the physical side of the economy is deteriorating because it shouldn't have been created in the first place. Same thing with houses. Houses are not productive assets, and yet we encourage people to buy the biggest house possible. On the assumption that that's some sort of investment, that's a place where you put your money and you actually increase your wealth. Well, that's not true. You once you have a house, you have to maintain that house, and that sucks in all your cash, and so you end up losing money on the deal eventually. So not only are we going deeply into debt, but we're going deeply into debt for stuff that we shouldn't have bought in the first place, and that's why we're getting poorer. That's why societal cash flow is plunging. And we've created the conditions for this to accelerate. This isn't going to get better. We're not doing anything to make it better. And so at some point in the not too distant future, we're looking at a falling off the table of national wealth in a way that can't be hidden anymore. They'll have to stop lying to us because we will figure it out. And it's just a question of when that day comes.
And it's fast approaching. I think we can both agree with that. John, can you tell our listeners how they could learn more about the things you do and your writing?
Sure. I run dollarcollapse.com and have just written a book with Gold Money's James Turk called The Money Bubble that covers a lot of the things you and I talked about here. So you can buy the book either at amazon.com or on the website dollarcollapse.com.
John, always enjoy our conversations, and there's I don't know what we're going to be talking about next month, but there's just so much to enjoy here. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your summer.
Thanks, Gordon. You too.
Talk to you later. Bye.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.